What do a plant, these stones, and this aquarium have in common? For years, the three were used to create environments for animals to thrive indoors, and now they're all about to be repurposed to craft something entirely new. A peninsula-style paludarium with self-watering moss arches and other details designed to look like a large landscape with the goal to house tiny creatures. This tank used to be for my guppies, who I recently moved into a large shallow setup because I had issues with this one, specifically its dimensions. In theory, a 24-inch cube tank should be great, but not in practice. I found it annoying to access, so when I decommissioned the old setup and considered how I could use it again, the answer was clear. Modify it so that it's easier to work with. To begin, I cut through the silicone around a single piece of glass to break the seal. This was the easy part. I cut the right side, then the left, and finally the bottom. Getting the glass clean enough to reseal is a little more annoying. All of the old silicone had to be removed, which takes some time. That said, it's important to note that I only scraped off what held the glass I removed and the internal seams. Everything else had to remain intact to maintain the tank's integrity. Once it was ready to go, I marked the glass for its new height and lined up a straight edge, which I clamped to the table. I ran the tool over the glass to distribute oil before scoring its surface. I like using this tool because it has a wedge on the back that makes it easy to separate thicker panels like this. Then I wet a sanding block to buff out the sharp edges. Reassembling it was simple. I put down some paper to preserve my work surface, taped for the silicone seams, and cleaned the surfaces with isopropyl alcohol. I also added bumpers to keep a gap between the glass. I've been using these bumpers for a while now, but not for injecting silicone. I liked how that went with the guppy tank and figured I'd try it again here on a smaller scale. That went pretty well. Then I ran the internal bead, evened it out, and removed the tape. While the silicone cured, I addressed another issue, the stand. It was taller than I'd like, and there was no better time than now to make it shorter. That was fairly simple too. First I removed the back and any remaining brads. Then I taped off the posts to preserve the existing finish before marking and cutting them to a shorter height. I notched them again for the top, finished the cuts, and reinstalled the pieces. The silicone had cured by then as well, so all I had to do then was reinstall the frost film and place the EVA leveling mat on the stand. Something about these dimensions makes carrying around 100-some pounds feel heavier than it probably should. I hoped cutting the front would lighten the load, but I didn't notice much of a difference. Anyway, with the tank now fully modified and on the stand, it was ready to become something new. To create what I imagined, I'd either have to drill a hole in the tank for an external filter or build a partition to create waterfalls. At the time, I didn't feel like drilling the glass, so I decided to make pump vaults from scraps of expanded PVC board. The beauty of this material is how quickly and easily you can work with it using a utility knife. Now when I was cutting these, I actually didn't know what pumps I was going to use, so I made them large enough to fit various models I had in storage. These also required a water pass-through, which I made with a hole saw. However, they couldn't remain open to the elements and required a barrier. I like this sun-blocking window screen because it's fine enough to keep animals and large debris out, while being permeable enough for optimal water flow. I secured these to the boards with cyanoacrylate, which highlights another thing I like about this material. It's effortless to assemble with CA. You simply run the glue where the pieces will meet up, join them, and within seconds they fuse together. Afterward, I cut off the corners and did a fit check. They looked great, and those cuts ensured they sat flush against the silicone seams. All I had to do then was stick them to the glass. I want to take a few moments to talk about these pump vaults because I did a few specific things with them that should make for a better design in the end. Now, the first and probably most important thing is the actual height of the structures themselves. You'll see that they're just taller than the front piece of glass, and that was very intentional. I don't want animals getting inside of the vault, and if the top of it is above the water line, in theory they shouldn't be able to. I also don't want any of it to be visible on the final design, so I'm going to have to hide it with the rocks and other hardscape elements, and if I were to have it going to the very top of the tank, for example, that would be a lot harder to do. And finally, when I go to install and service the pump, it'd be a lot more annoying if there was a further distance to travel. You'll see what I mean as we go through the build. I knew that hardscaping this would be one of the most challenging, time-consuming aspects of this project, and it was. What I had envisioned was something with several arches and water flowing over them. Something reminiscent of the self-watering jungle arch or the moss grotto fountain, but on a larger scale and full of life. I'd also have the added challenge of working within the Peninsula format intended to be viewed from 3 sides. Luckily, I had plenty of rocks from dismantled projects, so all I had to do was fit the puzzle together. As usual, I set a piece of egg crate on the bottom to distribute the weight of the stones evenly. Once I did, the next order of business was to hide the PVC. This part was pretty easy because I had something to prop up the rocks. However, they wouldn't stay like that without some assistance, in this case aquarium safe epoxy. Other than concealing the vaults, I was also mindful to make these structures as tall as possible. That's because I knew they would more or less become the foundation I'd connect to other rocks with arches. Height would make it easier to create those, and this rock was perfect for one of those connections because of its size. That said, it wasn't enough for it to just look good from the front because this is a peninsula setup. I had to move it around to ensure it looked good from all 3 sides. Unfortunately, I ran out of epoxy, and while I'd get more later, in the meantime I had to resort to waterfall foam. It's fine and cures faster, but it isn't as structurally sound as epoxy. As things set up, I could begin bridging the gaps to create arches. These 2 went in really well. This is also when I got more epoxy, so from here, I used it and the foam to build the structure stone by stone. However, this is where things began to get interesting. I'd use random things from around the room, like foam, filter tubes, and wire, to prop up the stones as they stabilized. It was quite the process, but the challenge is always part of what makes this fun. I also enjoy the fact that there are countless ways I could have done this. For example, I probably would have preferred to use the superglue and a mortaring material, but the nozzle on my bottle is too wide for precise application. I could have also drilled holes in the rocks and wired them together. If I were to do this all over, I think I'd do it like that instead. Regardless, I was making progress and ready for the defining feature, an arch spanning from one side to the other. With the help of several wires and foam shelves, I was able to provide enough stability to apply the adhesive. That concluded phase 1 of the scape, which I think came together well, but before I could continue, I had to sort out the pumps. First, I installed pre-filter sponges in each vault. Then I outfitted the pumps with rigid vinyl tubing to extend the connection point for other tubing I'd mount directly to the scape. I thought these would make it easier to access the pumps when necessary. However, as I added them, something detrimental happened. The arch I painstakingly built collapsed. I was kind of surprised by this. It felt good and stable, but I think it happened because I only used foam. That of course forced me to rebuild it before moving on, which while annoying, was necessary. This time I included epoxy and built it with 2 connection points, creating a Y shape. I didn't like it as much as before, but it would have to do. Now back to the task at hand, the pumps. What I had done before was taller than necessary, so I cut them before modifying this rib tubing. Its flexible ends made it ideal for this project. I can quickly connect or disconnect these from the pump without messing up the hardscape. That's important to mention because this is when I began wrapping the tubes around the scape. Initially I tied stainless steel wire around it and the stones. That worked, but I didn't want to hide it all later. Instead I drilled through the rocks to use less wire. This worked quite well and made me wish I had built the entire scape this way. Regardless, it made adding the tubes easy, though all this work left a lot of debris in the tank. Now I'm sure at this stage many of you are wondering, how could you possibly make something cool out of what I see right there? Give it some time. I know it looks a little bit rough. There's a lot more details and things that I'm going to add that will really take it to the next level. But at this point, I got to work out the mechanics and how it all functions before I can make it look pretty. To get that sorted out, it needed water, and I had to modify the flow. My plan was to drill through the tubing to create a soaker hose effect. I've done that many times before, so I had a decent idea of where to put the holes, but I couldn't tell to what extent it actually worked. That was until I plugged up the ends with my finger. While I was pleased with these results, it wasn't ready just yet. First, I dispersed the flow a little bit better by covering the tubes with geotextile. Then I rehydrated sphagnum moss and draped it over everything. It will wick and retain water, creating the ideal growing surface for moisture-loving plants like moss. I repeated the same process on the other side. This one was a little more lively, but the steps were the same. Drill the holes, add the fabric, and build up a layer of moss. Finally, I closed up the ends of the tubes, and the soaker effect was complete. Something I never really talk about that happens with nearly every project is the creative lull. It happens at different phases of a build and can be summed up as this. It's when I no longer feel inspired by the direction of a project. That's what I was dealing with at this point. I don't know why, but it just wasn't speaking to me, and the prospect of hiding the tubes was daunting. Occasionally I'll scrap a project altogether, but usually I just need to remain steadfast in the vision. There was no better time to start adding other elements than now. I hoped that these manzanita branches would help me see things differently. They fit perfectly around the stones and hid some of the tubing, which made everything look a little more dynamic. That's when I had a realization. I think the reason I'm struggling with this is the sameness of it all. While the branches helped, I believe it's actually the absence of other colors and textures that's really throwing me off. Even so, I had to deal with that sameness for a bit longer because it needed more details like spiderwood branches. I also had to do something about the gaps and visible tubing. While I did my best to hide everything I could, I had to keep reminding myself that it didn't have to be perfect. After all, I still hadn't added the plants yet. Before I could, I wanted to fill the tank to its actual depth, so I knew where to put the terrestrial items. First and probably most important was the moss. I used various species that would happily grow and thrive in these conditions. As soon as I placed this first patch of moss, my inspiration returned, and I was more than happy to get rid of that sameness. Patch by patch, I concealed all of the sphagnum moss with this moss, and trust me, I see the irony of that, but it works. Before long, this design went from purely functional to aesthetic. It didn't stop there either because I had more plants. While referred to as spike moss, this Selaginella is not moss. Nevertheless, its fine textures are equally appealing, and I felt they'd go a long way toward capturing the sense of scale. I pulled these sections off the mother plant, and nested the split ends in the wet moss to keep them hydrated. I knew that maintaining the sense of scale was very important to achieve the look I imagined, and with the theme of small plants, there was no better addition than oakleaf creeping fig. This is a pretty forgiving plant, so I knew I could keep it happy just as long as I got the roots into the moss. A small sense of scale can also be enhanced with larger leaved plants. Juxtaposing what I already added with things like Pilea and Photonia helped make them appear smaller. However, I wouldn't complete this area just yet. I simply wanted to set the foundation to minimize debris in the water feature. Even so, this before and after was amazing. That's when I shifted focus to the area below. I had to drain the water before adding some pre-rinsed sand. Truthfully, it was cold and rainy outside. I didn't feel like filming when I did that, so enjoy this footage of me rinsing it from a previous project. Anyway, I scooped it directly in without adding any other substrate. None of the aquatic plants would be very demanding. The nutrients produced within the system and supplementing with root tabs would be enough to sustain them in sand alone. From a design and functional perspective, I would have preferred using a slightly darker sand. However, this is what I had, and I think it complements the dragonstone well. Speaking of those, I added plenty of small accent pieces around the main structures to add more interest and improve the sense of depth. As I refilled the tank, I began considering which details would make this look its best. The first thing I needed was actually in a different tank, that one right there. I needed Anubias, and the ones in this tank could use a good trimming. I carefully snipped nodes off the rhizomes, and even though I ended up with 2 handfuls of plants for this new tank, it didn't appear to make a dent, which I appreciated. The beauty of Anubias is that it can grow epiphytically, meaning that it will root directly onto surfaces. That wasn't all, I also added many crypts. They're kinda interesting because they prefer high nutrient environments, yet will happily grow in tanks like this as well. When they do, they'll usually take on a smaller growth form, like this, which I think is pretty neat. Anytime I make these minimal type scapes, for whatever reason I always seem to add the same 3 plants, so I had to complete the trio with some Susvaser tong. Everything looked a little different a few days later. The plants in the water established well, but a few on top didn't look their best. Photonia cuttings often wilt and take time to perk up in a new environment, though I wish their journey had been smoother. A few segments of Selaginella were wilted too, and the Pilea had some browning. Despite all of that, the main parts of the plants looked good. While I enjoy the times I can avoid acclimation challenges like this, I go into these projects expecting them. None of this surprised me, especially since all of the plants were cuttings without established roots. What's ironic is that moss, which is generally slow growing, tends to have an initial boom when moved to a new home. So for a very brief window, it's actually growing faster than the other plants. Overall, this progress is promising, but it takes time for these setups to look their best, and my vision still hasn't been fully realized. I have a little bit of work left to do, and I still haven't added any of the animals. Since they were taking longer to acclimate than I'd like, I decided to pull the Photonia from the top. Eventually I'll use them for something else, but for now, I put them in one of my propagation tanks. I added a few ferns in their place, which are probably more appropriate for the design anyway. I really like how they look. I also trimmed off the withered tips of the Selaginella and planted a few more cuttings. All of these edits made me realize something else. It could look better with a few more branches and some Cryptanthus. The cool thing about these is that since they resemble the Cryptocorini in the water, they'll help blend this terrestrial area with the waters beneath. I'm excited to see how it matures from the 270-degree view, and I know it will only look better as it does. However, it's still missing the most important detail. Snails. I'm joking, of course, but I couldn't help myself. They have to go in every setup. I had a decent idea of what this design would look like before its inception, and with that in mind, I knew the inhabitants had to be red. After weighing my options, I ultimately decided on Ember Tetras. While I could predict they'd look good in here, I was curious to see what they'd think of their new home. Watching them weave through the arches and other parts of the hardscape as they scold was serene. I was hoping that would happen, and this is ultimately the reason why I chose Ember Tetras over something like Chili or Phoenix Rasbora. However, their true colors aren't going to show through until they fully settled into their new surroundings. In the meantime, I thought it would be a complete disservice not to collect a few cherry shrimp from other tanks to get a colony going in here as well. I think they'll enjoy it. One of my favorite parts about what I like to call nature design, things like this, is the recyclability of components. Except for the sand, adhesives, and a few plants, I built this almost entirely with materials from dismantled or currently running designs. Part of the fun for me is the challenge of reconfiguring old materials in new ways. Here the vision was to create an environment that appears like a larger landscape, and all things considered, I think it came together well. No doubt I'll use these materials for something else in the future, but until then, I'm excited to see how this environment, and the animals within, flourish. If you enjoyed this project, you'll also like the time I made a giant shallow aquarium for guppies, and a volcanic waterfall for endlers. As always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, Serpa Squad, take care, and peace.